Welcome, everyone, to Liberty Classroom's course, History of Economic Thought 1, Classical Economics and the Marginal Revolution. I am your instructor, Robert Murphy. We are now on Lecture 22, Part 3, the final part of our series on Eugen von Bawerk. So what we're going to be covering here is, first of all, I'm going to refresh your memory as to Bawerk's framework. Then I'm going to talk about how Austrian economists think about economic growth, because we'll see it's different from certainly what the layperson thinks of, and even in contrast to some other mainstream economists. Then we're going to talk about Bawerk's notion of the average period of production. Then we're going to hit Irving Fisher's objection to Bawerk's approach. And finally, we're going to wrap up with a discussion of the modern Austrian, what's called the pure time preference theory of interest, and its relationship to the work of Bawerk. So let me again remind you that what we're doing here with Bawerk is much more in-depth than you would get in a standard History of Economic Thought series. And the reason is that this is my area of expertise, that I did my dissertation largely on the work of Bawerk. And quite frankly, when I read conventional historians of economic thought and they try to summarize for their readers what Bawerk said, they don't quite get it right. That I can just tell they didn't really grasp it. So I want to spend some time on this to really just put down a marker, as it were, in a more accessible place. So certainly in my dissertation for my PhD in economics, I got into an exposition of what I was interpreting Bawerk's point to be and defending him from some critics. But I thought also in this venue, for a more lay audience, it would be useful for me to go ahead and make the case while I'm going through the history of economic thought. Also, since I believe many of you taking Liberty Classroom are going to be fans of the Austrian school, it certainly is useful and helpful to go over some of these points, because this does help you understand the development of certain trends in the Austrian tradition. Another thing is just, why do it in this particular class? Because, hey, I might get hit by a bus next week, and if I do, as I'm lying there dying, I'll say, but at least I got down these thoughts on Bawerk in this Liberty Classroom course. So let's review now Bawerk's framework, which we developed in the last lecture. So remember, 2 lectures ago, Bawerk set up the interest problem, said, why is it that capitalists, when they invest in factors of production, typically when the final product is sold for revenue and the capitalist gets his share, why is it typically the case that that share is higher than the amount of money the capitalist put in up front? And so if this process repeats itself, it's like the capitalist gets this endless and effortless flow of wealth. Why is that? How is that possible? What principles govern this market phenomenon? And then we walked through some other explanations, and Bawerk refuted all of them. Said, no, that can't be it, that can't be it, that can't be it. And finally, he presented his own positive theory, which we covered last lecture, where Bawerk said, the nub and kernel of my explanation is this insight. Present goods are, as a rule, worth more than future goods of equal quality and quantity. Now, you might say, when you say present goods are worth more or have more value, what does he mean? Does he mean subjectively, or is he talking about market price? Or what? Well, he means both. That originally, like in terms of the more fundamental explanation, it starts in the subjective valuation of the human mind. Subjective preferences, people would choose, they prefer, typically, Bawerk would say, present goods rather than those same goods not available until a future date. And now, because of that widespread subjective preference in terms of the marginal utility from a good available right now versus that same good not available until years down the road, that's what causes the market prices to reflect those subjective valuations. And thus, in the marketplace, we see present goods have a higher price, a higher market value than those same goods that right now are only available in the future. So this is why I said that Bawerk's interest theory, you can think of it as simply applying the Mengerian insights into value and market price in an intertemporal context. That all really Bawerk was doing was taking the new marginal utility subjective approach to value and price, which got rid of the old cost of production labor theory of value approach and replaced it with this new subjective approach. And Bawerk just thought through the implications of that in the context of production processes that take a long time and that use up capital goods during the course of their operations. And he realized that to explain interest, to explain why is it that present resources do not have as high a price as the future products they're expected to yield, Bawerk realized, oh, you know what that is? That's because when we buy those resources today and the goods, the TV they're expected to produce, we know we're going to sell for $100. But as of right now, these resources we're buying to make that TV are technological claim tickets, if you will, entitling us to a TV in the future. And so right now, a, quote, future TV is not worth as much to us as that TV will be once it's a present good. So if we know down the road we'll sell the TV for $100, right now, today, when that TV is just a distant prospect, we would not pay $100 today for that TV. We would only pay a smaller amount. And so to buy resources that will produce a TV down the road, right now we would not pay fully $100 for those resources. Why would we pay $100 for resources that are technological claim tickets on something that we don't value at $100 right now? So that's why there's this, quote, undervaluation of the apparent undervaluation of the resources that are going to be used to produce some product down the road. It's not really an undervaluation. The point is it's the correct valuation once you take into account the fact that present goods are worth more than future goods, subjectively. Okay, so that's the nub and kernel of his explanation, but he didn't stop there. He then offered 3 grounds or causes for the higher subjective valuation of present goods versus future goods. The first ground that Bawerk discussed was the fact that the conditions of supply and demand are going to be more favorable down the road. We're going to be better provided for in terms of our wants down the road than we are right now. And so on that ground alone, because of what we nowadays would call diminishing marginal utility, on the margin, we would rather get delivery of a commodity today rather than just get a ticket that entitles you to that unit of the commodity down the road, because down the road, it's not going to be as scarce. The second ground for undervaluation or for higher valuation of present goods versus future goods is that Bawerk said we have a systematic tendency to undervalue future want satisfaction. So from our current vantage point, when we're thinking about the future and how, we're going to have wants in the future and goods that are available in the future can help us satisfy those wants, today when we're thinking about that distant prospect, those future wants do not affect us as much. We don't feel them with as much intensity as wants hitting us right now. And so even if you didn't have the first ground, even if the supply and demand conditions were such that the availability of bread today was just what we thought it was going to be 10 years from now, Bawerk's arguing that if you say to somebody, hey, do you want a loaf of bread right now or do you want a loaf of bread in 10 years, the present hunger seems like a more important thing to you right now than you imagining your hungry belly 10 years from now and thinking about, that loaf of bread in 10 years would also be nice to satisfy that hunger at that point. And so if you buy into that, that explains, that's yet another reason, an independent reason, why people tend to prefer receiving a present loaf of bread versus a loaf of bread that's not going to be delivered until 10 years from now. Now, the really controversial one, so economists didn't really have a problem with those first 2 grounds, but now the controversial one Bawerk said there is another, what he thought was independent reason for people to prefer present goods versus future goods, namely what he called the technical superiority of present goods. So he put that word technical in there, meaning, to underscore that he's not bringing in value yet, because what he's ultimately trying to explain is the higher valuation of present goods. So it would be arguing in a circle to say present goods are more valuable than future goods because, among other reasons, they have superior value. Then, yeah, you would just be assuming the conclusion. But he's saying, no, present goods I can show empirically have a technical superiority, and then that is why we subjectively value them more. And so here, this involved what Bawerk famously or infamously referred to as the higher productivity of more roundabout capitalistic processes. So remember, last lecture I gave you the example. Somebody's out in the forest by himself, or a tropical island, I should say, and he knows he's thirsty right now, and he knows he's going to be thirsty every day for the rest of his life, and there's a stream of running water. So he has different production processes available to him to harness that water to satisfy his thirst. A very direct, non-roundabout process is him just to go up, walk up to the stream, kneel down, and cup his hands and start drinking the water that way. But that's not very productive physically in terms of how many gallons of water can he get into his belly per hour of his labor power. If you want to quantify it in that way, it's not very productive, but it's very quick. He gets the results virtually immediately. Now, what if he has more time to work with? Well, now he can adopt a more roundabout process. So, for example, if he sees some coconuts on a nearby tree, he can climb the tree, get the coconuts down, go get a rock, smash open the coconut, hollow it out, and now he's got like a little bowl type of implement. And he can use that to get the water out, and that's more convenient, and there's going to be less spillage and so on. So if you especially consider the fact that he could use that bowl for a while, and then at the end of that period of production, if you look backwards and say, okay, how many total labor hours did he put into this, and how many gallons of water did he get into his belly when all was said and done, you would find his labor power is apparently more productive physically in this sense, right? In terms of how many gallons of water is he getting in his belly. Because he used some of his labor power originally to climb the tree and get the coconut, and then to go get a rock and smack it open and so on. So the idea is, but the problem is, or the trade-off, is that takes longer. Right? If he were dying of thirst, and originally he wouldn't have time to go climb a tree and find a rock and do all that. So he would just go right to the stream right away. But the point is, once he satisfies his immediate desire for water, he might then invest his labor hours in a longer project, namely the construction of this little bowl implement. What if he wants to invest in a much, much, much longer process, more roundabout? What would he do? Well, maybe he goes, gets some sturdy tree branches and straightens one of them out, and sharpens it and whatever, makes it come to a nice edge, and then gets a smooth stone and gets some vines and somehow attaches it. So he creates a crude shovel, and then he starts digging a trench from the stream to his shelter. And so this might be a long process, taking months, perhaps even longer, but when all is said and done, he gets it so that when he gets up in the morning, now he's got the stream coming into his window. And so now, he doesn't have to go walk to the stream to cup the hands or whatever. He's just got this flowing water that's coming right into where he's staying. He's got the water right there. He can just go and put his face up to it. So now, yeah, that took a much bigger input of labor hours and took a longer time for the project to be completed. But once he has it up and running, and you start quantifying at any given time, okay, looking backwards, how many total labor hours did he put into this project, and how many gallons of water has he gotten into his belly now because of it? It would be blow the other two out of the water, no pun intended. But of course, the downfall or the downside is this is a much longer project. And so before he begins it, he would have to realize, wow, this is going to take a while to finish, for me to see the fruits of my labor in this really long roundabout process. But if I am willing to go down that path, when I'm done, I'll be very well provided for in terms of, what I can use water for and getting it to where I need it to be. So, because of that, if you've bought that story and you understand Bawerk's framework, he's saying this is yet another completely independent reason that I would want to receive a good sooner rather than later. Because the earlier I get my hands on a commodity, that gives me more options. I can devote it to a longer, more roundabout production process. And if those are more physically productive, then in a sense, that means when I get my hands on a commodity sooner rather than later, I can ultimately transform that into more units of output good. And so since more goods are preferable to fewer goods, then that's why a commodity delivered to me sooner rather than later has a higher market value or higher subjective value to me, and hence market value. So Bawerk thought that is yet another independent reason. And he said this is what a lot of the writers, they were all groping around with the fact that capitalistic production is more efficient or more productive. And Bawerk just thought a lot of the writers didn't have a great framework for handling those empirical facts, whereas he thought his framework avoided the fallacies he had spotted in all the other expositions and correctly interpreted this very important fact about the world, namely that if you don't just directly attack a problem by applying your raw labor power with your bare hands and then aided by raw nature, but instead you first construct intermediate capital goods, that process ends up being far more productive in the sense of look at how much output you get compared to how much total input did you use if you first build up some intermediate capital goods. Okay, let me talk a little bit more about this last point about economic growth. So why is it, for example, if we look at our standard of living today, we're clearly much wealthier. We have a higher standard of living than people say back in the year 1850. So why is that? So the average person is probably going to say, oh, well, technology, scientists and engineers and so forth, they have just discovered new cause and effect relationships in terms of how the world works, the laws of physics or whatever, and inventors have just made new products and things like that. And so we just have more technical knowledge today than people did in 1850. And so that's why, we live better than people in 1850 lived. So that's certainly true, but the Austrians typically point out that leaves out the huge role that saving and investment play in raising living standards. So a good way, let me just try two ways to motivate that. One thing is to point out that right now, there are some countries that are very wealthy and have a high standard of living, and there are other countries that don't, that are pretty poor, at least in terms of material things. And so you say, well, why is that? Well, it's not because the smartest people in the poor countries are ignorant and that they're using the laws of physics as they were thought to be back in 1875 or something like that. No, the doctors and the engineers and the mathematicians and so forth from even very poor regions of the world, they can go and train at some of the best Western universities and medical schools. So it's not a lack of knowledge or technological recipes. They can know, they can come work for a U.S. firm and see how they build bridges in the United States, or they can come and train under a heart surgeon at some of the best hospitals in the United States, do their residency or whatever, and then they go back to their country in Africa and they don't have nearly as much success. The patients who have heart conditions in their home country die, whereas that same patient, if he were in the United States and received care at the hospital where the doctor trained, might survive. So why is that? It's not because of a lack of knowledge or education. It's because when they go back to their home country, they don't have the same tools and infrastructure to work with. So that's underscoring the fact that it's not merely technological know-how. You have to have the accompanying capital goods structure to augment your bare labor. Another way perhaps of motivating it is, suppose you had a cruise ship that had some of the smartest, best trained professionals on planet Earth. You had some of the best heart surgeons, best brain surgeons, greatest mathematicians, some of the leading experimental physicists, all kinds of great stuff like some of the best engineers, guys who were, and women, let's not be sexist, who were developing prototypes for the next Ferrari engine and so on. They're on this cruise ship, and then the ship, there's a calamity, a big storm, and they somehow get marooned on a tropical island where they're completely isolated. And now it's these people, 3,000 people stuck on this tropical island. If you check in on them 5 years later, what's their standard of living going to be like? A bunch of them are probably going to be dead. And it's because even though they have all the latest technical knowledge and so on, they're going to be using the supplies that are on the cruise ship, and then once those run out, they're going to be in serious trouble because they're going to have and we can even say they got a bunch of raw materials to work with. Maybe the island has crude oil deposits, it has nice fertile farmland and everything like that, but the people are going to look at the tools they have on the cruise ship in their bare hands and the knowledge that's in their minds and say, we have nothing to work with here. Back home, we had huge John Deere tractors, right? Some of the people there who might be the world's best farmers the people on the cruise ship are going to look to them and say, oh, well, you can feed us, right? And they're going to say, no, because look what we have to work with. Back home, we had all kinds of specially designed fertilizer. We had massive tractors. We had all kinds of irrigation equipment. We had soil that had been cultivated in a certain way over decades. We got none of that here. We got to start from scratch. And, someone's got chest pains. They look at the world's best heart surgeon who's right there and say, oh, well, you can help him, right, doctor? And he said, no, what do I have to work with here? We can't even get a sanitary environment. You kidding me? I can't perform on this guy. So you can see there the distinction between mere technological recipes versus having accumulated capital equipment over decades or centuries. And so that, in the Austrian tradition, they really stress the importance of that. And so Mises argues that part of what happened, the reason the Western European nations leapfrogged ahead of the rest of the world in terms of their standard of living was that they, for various reasons, almost stumbled upon the protection of private property rights, and that fostered saving and accumulation. And so the people in what we now call the Western countries accumulated more capital goods than people in other areas, and that greatly enhanced the physical productivity of their labor. And so that's why they're so much more productive. The people in the United States right now, the reason they're so much more productive than people in Bangladesh, it's not because U.S. public schools are so great and kids come out of public schools with so much knowledge. It's because when you go to work at a U.S. company, you are augmented by all sorts of capital equipment that is lacking in Bangladesh. And where does capital equipment come from? It comes from prior acts of saving, that instead of devoting resources to the production of consumption goods in relatively short processes, instead people invest their labor and natural resources in much longer projects that have a higher physical yield, but the trade-off is you got to wait longer for it. So you can see how this all ties back to the bawerkian framework, and a lot of the issues that he talked about have been adopted by modern Austrians, even though they didn't carry through all the little elements of his system. In particular, Bawerk had this concept called the average period of production. So, after giving some cute little anecdotes and stories to motivate his idea of roundaboutness, he then said, okay, can we quantify that? And so he wanted to say, all right, yeah, what you do is you look at an economy and you say, on average, how long are the pure or raw labor factors and natural resource factors tied up in a typical production process before they're used to produce the final consumption good that then gets, consumed by somebody in the society. So the longer the production process is, that means labor and land factors are first used to make capital goods, and then those capital goods are used to make more capital goods, and so on and so forth. And so Bawerk thought a more capitalistic roundabout economy has a much longer period of production on average, that the people, the firms there, or the whole structure of production, it might be like one firm doing one little product and passing it along to the next firm, but when you look at the whole thing from 30,000 feet, you can see it as one giant, very roundabout production process. There might be firms that dig up the crude oil, and then they put it in barrels and then pass it along to some other firm that puts it in a warehouse. They pass it along to some other firm. They bring it to the refinery, and so that's a much more productive way of transportation, of moving people around, than using stagecoaches and horses. But it's a much longer, more roundabout process to first start digging up crude oil as opposed to just raising a horse, if the goal is ultimately to move people or goods around. Somebody who didn't know anything about oil and gasoline and motor vehicles, if they said, the problem is we want to be able to move stuff from Florida to New York, you want to move oranges, how are you going to do that? Somebody starts raising horses, that would make sense. He says, okay, I get that, because horses can pull stuff. All right, fair enough. But somebody starts building an offshore oil rig. If you didn't know anything about that, you would say, what the heck are you doing? I thought you wanted to move oranges. But knowing what you do know, you say, wait, trust us. This is going to be a very long process. But once we get the crude oil out of the ocean, refine it into gasoline, we got these people over here making factories. They're going to produce these things we call cars, or 18-wheelers, even better. Wait till you see, once we finish all these really long projects, how efficient it will be to move oranges from Florida to New York. But it's going to take a while for us to get into the position to be able to see the benefits of doing it this way. All right, so I'm just trying to give you different examples to motivate this thinking so you understand where Bawerk was coming from. So he wanted to be able to quantify that. And so he said, okay, let's call it the average period of production. And say, on average, how long are raw labor power and natural resource land factors tied up in production processes before they are used to yield a final consumption good. And so you average that across the economy as a whole, and that comes up with a number. And so economies that are more roundabout have a higher, longer average period of production than other ones, and they're more capitalistic. So you would expect the people in that economy to have a higher standard of living. And you would also expect that in general, as the capital accumulates, so the society's the longer period of production, the higher average period of production, you would expect them to be more capitalistic, that you would see them have more accumulated machinery and so on, have more tools and things like that. And you would also expect to see interest rates in that world be lower than in a different one. Again, here I'm focusing on the way Bawerk developed the argument and the way his immediate disciples sort of inherited this framework and tried to use it. So he seemed to be explaining saving and accumulation, the social function of capitalists, if you will, the social function of interest rate payments. But there were lots of problems with this. It's far beyond the scope of this particular lecture to get into them. Let me just say that you can come up with even fairly simple examples of economies where this approach doesn't work. Like, you can't just, in general, you can't just look at an economy and its production process and say, oh, this one has an average period of production of such and such, and then look at some neighboring economy and say, oh, the production period over here is longer, so therefore we would expect them to have lower interest rates and a higher standard of living. And there's serious problems when you try to do that in just purely physical terms. So some Austrians still think that this is a decent concept if you think of it just in terms of money and almost arguing by a priori definitions. But in terms of the way Bawerk tried to do it, thinking you could just look at physical facts about technology and how it was used and come up with a single number to characterize an economy, that was a really dubious proposition. And even Austrians kind of said, yeah, that doesn't work. Just moved on. Okay, let me now turn to the objection of Irving Fisher. So just for your background knowledge, and we're going to cover Fisher if you come with me in the second part of this sequence, and for the Liberty Classroom, A History of Economic Thought, Irving Fisher was a giant in modern neoclassical economics, but among his contributions, he's considered to be, I guess you call him the father of modern interest theory in the mainstream neoclassical tradition. So he acknowledged his debt to Bawerk. Irving Fisher did. But Fisher thought he had taken what was good in Bawerk and discarded what was superfluous or confusing and given a much leaner theory to handle the sorts of insights that Bawerk made. And in particular, Irving Fisher famously argued, remember those three grounds or those three causes that Bawerk had given for why present goods are more valuable than future goods? Irving Fisher comes along and says, wait a minute, that third ground, that alleged third ground, is not really an independent force. To the extent that it's true that, the more capitalistic roundabout processes are, the more physically productive your raw labor is going to end up being, or your raw natural resource inputs are going to be. Fisher argued that just, to the extent that contributes to the higher valuation of present goods, it just works through the first and possibly the second causes. So remember, the first cause said the reason, or one reason, you might value present more than future goods is that you're going to be more amply provided for down the road. You're going to have more wheat down the road, and so that's why you would rather get a bushel of wheat today rather than a promise entitling you to a bushel of wheat in 10 years. And so Fisher is saying, all of Bawerk's very great discussion, perfectly useful and informative about roundabout processes and how that works and capital accumulation and so on, great. That's good in terms of capital theory, but in terms of interest theory, all that means is it explains why when we're looking ahead 10 years from now, we're going to anticipate we're going to have a lot more wheat than we do now, because we know we're going to use roundabout, technically superior processes. And so because we're going to have more wheat, that means the margin utility of wheat in the future is going to be lower than right now, and so that's why we prefer present wheat. But that's what Bawerk called the first cause, right? So Irving Fisher, to summarize, thought Bawerk's third ground was not really an independent force operating side by side with grounds 1 and 2. He said that it was the first two in disguise. So here, Bawerk was just, you could tell he was flummoxed. He was getting very frustrated. It's too much in the weeds to try to reproduce here, but I think he was using exclamation points in his response to Fisher on this point, was saying, like, by what law of logic or reason should we deny that this is an independent cause? And he was coming up with pretty funny analogies to try to really isolate what does it mean when we talk about different causes or factors being present and them being independent from each other, right? So the issue here is, could there be a cause that would operate that, it might end up having effects that then also trickle back or feed back through the other causes, but the point is this third thing a separate independent factor? And Bawerk, even after arguing with Fisher, thought, of course it is. So let me give you an example to try to get you to see where Bawerk was coming from. So let's put it this way. Suppose right now you have some event that's going to happen in 10 years. And you're going to throw a giant party, let's say, in 10 years. So you want to just set in motion production processes that are going to produce all the stuff you want for this big party that's going to happen in 10 years from today. All right, the date is set. There's no question about moving the date of the party. Everything you're going to be doing is gearing up for this huge bash you're throwing 10 years from now. The date is set. And now someone says, okay, I have an hour of labor that we're just going to give you for free. Do you want it right now? Or do you want us to deliver this hour of labor to you 5 years from now? So let me make it 6 years from now, just so that we don't get mixed up with the math. Okay, so that's the choice I face. I can get an hour of labor delivered to me right now, or I get a piece of paper that's an airtight, guaranteed claim on an hour of comparably skilled labor that's going to be delivered 6 years from now. And I'm going to use them either, whichever one I pick, I'm going to devote it to this project of getting stuff ready for this big bash I'm throwing in 10 years. So bawerk's point here is, because of the technical superiority of present goods, if I get that labor hour delivered to me right now, I can invest it in a 10-year process. Whereas if I don't get that labor hour until 6 years from now, all I can do is invest it in a 4-year process. Because either way, by assumption in this example, I'm going to devote my resources into processes that yield their output just in time for this big bash I'm throwing in 10 years. And so which of the two would I, well, if the longer, more roundabout processes are more physically productive, like let's say I devote it to making, those party favors, those things that unfurl like you use at New Year's, those things that you use at New Year's, you put them in your mouth and blow into them and they unfurl and make the whiny noise. Let's say I'm making those. So if I get the labor hour now, I can devote it to a 10-year process that when I look back at that 10-year process and how many of those things it makes and how many total labor hours I put into it, the labor hour that I'm putting here up front, maybe I use it to build some kind of tool that helps me to make those things. Whereas the labor hour I'm not going to have for 6 years, I wouldn't have enough time to finish the tool. Like we'd have to do something else, right? And that would be less productive. And so when I'm looking back and saying the labor hour today, if I devote it in this 10-year process, how many of those finished products of those whiny noisemaker things can I attribute to that hour? Maybe the answer is, 10 of them. Whereas the thing that's only available in 6 years, maybe really that on the margin is only increasing my yield by 4 of those things, those things. So the question is, the hour of labor today ultimately means I have 10 of those things at the date of the party. The hour delivered to me 6 years from now means I only have 4 of those things available. So the question is, at the same date of the party, do I want 10 of those noisemakers or do I only want 4? And bawerk thinks clearly you want 10. And so if I have which is more valuable to me? Right now, what's more valuable to me? 10 of those things available in 10 years or 4 of those things available in 10 years? And he's going to say clearly 10. So if the hour of labor now is the means, technologically speaking, to those 10 noisemakers, and the hour of labor delivered in 6 years is the technological means, the claim ticket on those 4, which do I prefer right now? Well, I prefer the hour right now. So again, if the question is what's preferable subjectively, an hour of labor delivered to you now or an hour of labor not delivered to you until 6 years from now, clearly the present one. So present goods, present resources are preferable to future resources. Other things equal, I would want to take delivery of any kind of productive agent sooner rather than later. And so the question is this really just the first 2 grounds in disguise? And bawerk would say, well, no, how could it be? There's no question about, having a better provision of goods in the future than today. The trade-off, I'm not saying, do I want to have noisemakers in 10 years or noisemakers right now? So the fact that there's more noisemakers available in 10 years, that's not reducing their marginal utility compared to a noisemaker now. No, the issue, what I'm comparing is 10 noisemakers then in 10 years compared to 4 noisemakers then in 10 years. So the dating is the same. So clearly the first round has nothing to do with it, nor does the second round. And yet, if those technological facts are, as I said, that clearly gives us an incentive to want to get the labor hour sooner rather than later. Okay, so that is a very comprehensive way, but I walked through that carefully. This is a very esoteric area, but nonetheless, like I said, it disturbs me that when I read historians of economic thought, I don't think they get that. And I'm just sort of being perhaps a bit biased and defensive of bawerk, but I can fully understand why he was going nuts arguing with people saying, how could this not be an independent cause? And he was coming up with, obviously he didn't come up with an example of people making noisemakers with a big party, but he came up with examples along the lines of what I just did there to try to get people to see this is not just me citing the first two causes and working through them via other mechanisms. This is a completely independent reason. Okay, so now the remaining few minutes we have for this lecture, let's turn to the modern Austrians in what they have taken from bawerk and what they've discarded. So Frank Fetter, now some people would call him part of maybe what would be called like the psychological school. All right, so he was an economist who Austrians appreciate his work, and since by calling him a member of the psychological school, what people mean is that Fetter really stressed the importance of subjectivism in economic theory. And so in that respect, he's a fellow traveler with the Austrians. And so Fetter thought that bawerk, he acknowledged his greatness, and yes, bawerk really cleared away a lot of the confusions and fallacies in the field, cleaned it all up. But ironically, when he himself then gave his own positive theory of capital, he gave a theory of interest involving a productivity explanation. And so Fetter was surprised by that and said, but no, didn't bawerk teach us in his volume 1 that productivity is not the approach here, that productivity explains rental prices, it does not explain interest? So if you think back to that naive productivity theory and how bawerk critiqued it, which we went over in part 1 of this lecture series on bawerk. So Fetter put forth what he called a capitalization theory of interest, where Fetter said, look, any productive agent, whether it's land, labor, or capital goods, you can use the principle of marginal productivity to figure out what's the increment in output because of using this factor versus not. Then you look at what's the difference in value from that higher output of the consumption good. And then that's the marginal utility attributable to that factor, and that explains its rental price. So you have a tractor, the fact that more crops are produced with the tractor with than without, yeah, that's important. You need to know that, and it has something to do with value and market price, but what it explains is the rental price of the tractor. So if you own the tractor, you get a flow of income by renting it out to farmers or whatever. Okay. But then remember, if you want to say, how do you figure out the present price of the tractor, you can't point to the tractor's productivity to answer that question, Fetter says. He says, no, what you do is you look forward, you take that tractor and you anticipate what are the rental payments that are going to accrue to it over time, and then you have to discount them somehow using some psychological subjective discount rate to turn those future dollars into their present spot value. And then when you do that, you come up with a present value in dollar terms of the tractor. And if that's a lower number than those future rental payments, that's why you're going to earn interest over time. But clearly the interest you earn has nothing to do with the fact that the tractor is physically productive. It has to do with the fact that when you bought the tractor, you were subjectively discounting those future cash flows. And that's something in your mind that's psychological, that's not some technical physical fact about reality. That has to do with subjectivism. So that was Fetter's theory, and again, he was just saying it's amazing that bawerk fell into this fallacy because he was the one who taught us how to avoid it. And then Ludwig von Mises picked up on this. So in Human Action, Mises explicitly endorses Fetter's take, and then Mises offers what he calls a pure time preference theory of interest. And so, I mean, Mises' theory was basically Fetter's, just Mises thought that he grounded it in a priori considerations. Mises thought that human action by its very nature necessarily means that people prefer present goods to future goods, other things equal, and that for the same satisfaction, you would prefer to satisfy it or to enjoy it sooner rather than later, just by the nature of action itself. Whereas Fetter had just been more empirical, saying, well, yeah, it just seems to be a fact of the world that most people have positive time preference. But he didn't say, like, that necessarily has to be the case, whereas Mises said, no, this flows from the nature of action itself. But in terms of explaining interest in the market, Mises adopted Fetter's approach wholeheartedly. And Mises also agreed with Fetter that, yeah, it's ironic, Bawerk was the great pioneer. He showed us the way. He really gave us a lot, but alas, at the last moment, he tripped up with his own theory. Also, just so you know, this is an area where the Austrian school is considered to be sort of quaint by their mainstream colleagues. The mainstream view, drawing from the work of Irving Fisher, which again we're going to cover in great detail in the next part of this history of economic thought sequence. The mainstream view, if you ask a regular mainstream economist, hey, you know, what principles determine the interest rate in an economy? They're going to say, oh, well, in equilibrium, at least if we have competitive markets, the equilibrium real interest rate is going to be equal to the marginal product of capital. So in their mind, it's analogous to wage rates, where in equilibrium with competitive markets, the wage rate's equal to the marginal product of labor. And the thinking is, well, if some employer was paying you less than the marginal product of your labor, well, then competition ensures that some other employer would come along and outbid them. And you would keep getting higher wage bids until the point at which your employer was paying you just what you were causing their total output to go up by. So you were being fully compensated for the value of your labor. And so by the same token, mainstream economists I think if you grabbed a random mainstream economist who wasn't trained in the areas of capital and interest theory, and you said, hey, explain interest, how does that work? They'd say, oh, well, the interest rate's the price of borrowing capital, and so firms will, borrow capital, and an equilibrium will have to pay just what the increment of output is due to that last unit of capital that they added on the margin. And, if the interest rate were lower than that, then, the capitalists wouldn't be earning enough, and if it were higher, then firms wouldn't be paying for it. They wouldn't be willing to pay that much. So in equilibrium, when firms borrow an extra unit of capital, their output goes up by a certain amount, and then that's what they got to pay to the capitalists, for the reward for that, the price of that. So that thinking is totally wrong. That is the naive productivity theory, or at least it's very much related to it. And so that's why modern Austrians will often say mainstream economists haven't even caught up to 1884 in our tradition. They're doing with their fancy math models the same fallacies that Bawerk blew up back in the 1880s. We don't have time to develop this much further. Let me just say this in terms of Murphy's take on this dispute, because that might seem surprising. You might say, come on, how could these mathematical economists, you're saying there's a problem with their equations? Come on, how can that be? I spent some time, I struggled with this myself. Again, I went to NYU. That was a pretty top-ranked economics department. I learned all these mathematical equations. And in the world of the neoclassical mathematical models, dating back to the Walrasian approach, what they were saying was correct. In equilibrium, the real interest rate did have to equal the marginal product of capital. Like the math was right, the calculus checked out, but yet reading the verbal exposition of Bawerk, it looked like he was surely correct, and that no, the productivity of capital goods explains their rental rate. It doesn't explain the appreciation in market value that the capitalist wealth achieves over time. So how can this be? And the solution is that I hit upon is that in standard mainstream mathematical models, they usually just have one good. And so it's like they'll have some good that you can consume it today, or if you don't, it grows over time exponentially. And that's supposed to capture like the physical productivity of longer production processes. And so or you can put it into a production function, augmenting it with labor, and it creates more output that you can then either consume or then add to the capital stock, right? So, but the point is, there's just like one physical thing that you either eat or put back into the production function, and it serves as a capital good. So that, for a lot of mainstream economists, that's kind of like the workhorse they use, and they believe that's a harmless simplification. They know in the real world, yeah, there's tractors that make oranges, and tractors and oranges aren't the same thing. Yeah, we know that. But in a lot of mainstream mathematical models with production functions and blah, 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 they don't have that kind of subtlety in there, and that's a huge problem. That Bawerk's, the fallacy of the naive productivity theory, collapses if you have one good. And so if you write out mathematical equations describing an economy that only has one good that can be either capital or consumption, Bawerk's critique can't happen. It's like you define it out of existence. So his critique is still valid in general, but it's like they mathematically describe a world where his critique actually doesn't matter. And then they erroneously conclude when they then, with words, talk about this model and say, oh yeah, in equilibrium in an economy, the interest rate equals the marginal product of capital. What they're thinking from that, the economic lessons they're deriving, are wrong. But it's actually not wrong mathematically in the very specialized artificial world they've developed with their equations. All right, so I realize that might be beyond the scope or even interest of many of you, or the knowledge of many of you, but I didn't want to leave you hanging. I wanted to at least officially state that view somewhere, and this lecture seemed like the place to do it. Okay, very last thing I want to say is, in conclusion with all this stuff, even though I am not a fan of Bawerk's overall theory, this might surprise you. Are you kidding me? You just spent 3 lectures defending the guy from his critics, and now you're telling us you don't even endorse his theory? Yes, that is what I'm telling you. But hey, this is a course in the history of economic thought, and say what you will, you've gotten a lot of history of economic thought in this discussion of Bawerk. What I am saying, though, is that the Austrians like Mises and Rothbard, who endorsed Feder's critique, I think they did a disservice to Bawerk. I don't think it's true to say that his own theory relapsed into the productivity fallacies that he had so brilliantly exploded earlier. So I think the way I've just described it to you, you can see how that is. That long example I went over about 10 minutes ago in this lecture about the party that's going to happen in 10 years. I hope you saw there the way Bawerk was thinking about it, and that he was not saying that physical facts per se directly cause value. He was saying, no, if physical facts cause there to be more product, and he was showing that a present unit of labor is more subjectively valuable than a future unit of labor. Well, that is what contributes to present goods being more valuable than future goods. All right, so that wasn't the kind of fallacy that somebody who says, oh, tractors can produce more stuff than without tractors, and therefore that's why the purchase price of a tractor is a lot lower than the products is expected to yield. Well, no, that Bawerk didn't do a problem like that. Bawerk wasn't saying, for example, that, labor today has a lower price than the 10 party favor, noisemakers it's going to make 10 years from now, because it's productive, and that's why the capitalists earn interest. That would be the naive productivity fallacy. But no, what Bawerk was arguing, again in my silly example, was to say a unit of labor today is going to be more valuable than a unit of labor, say, 6 years from now, because no matter what date I want the goods to be available, I will always have more the earlier you give me that labor. And so that is not the same thing as the fallacy he blew up. Last thing, I'll just make an analogy to try to get you to see what I think Feder and Mises and Rothbard did with Bawerk. Imagine somebody reads Menger blowing up Ricardo on the labor theory of value. He reads Menger, he reads Bawerk, he reads Wieser, and he says, oh yeah, these Austrians are right. They have shown me, they've convinced me that value resides in the mind. It's not about physical facts, and for sure, the number of labor hours you put into something, that's not what causes it to have value. So the classical economists were wrong. These modern Austrians, these guys have it. They're great. And then you ask the Austrians, hey, how are wages determined? And they give you the marginal productivity theory. And they say, oh, well, because workers, an hour of labor produces such and such physical product, and so the workers who are more productive, they get paid more. And the critic says, whoa. Didn't you guys just get through telling me that labor doesn't cause value? And yet now when I'm asking you to explain why this worker gets paid twice as much as that worker, I was expecting you to say because his employer subjectively values his work twice as much. But now you just start telling me about how many apples they produce per hour and that this worker produces twice as many apples, so that's why his paycheck's twice as high. Haven't you ironically relapsed back into the labor theory of value? Well, you can see how that would be missing the point. And that, no, yeah, maybe we took a shortcut in the explanation, but ultimately, of course, the reason this worker is getting paid twice as much is the employer subjectively values his efforts twice as much than the other guy, or more than the other guy, and you can come up with a way to just explain why it would result in payments twice as high in terms of money. But when you say, why is it that the employer of the really productive worker values his efforts more, you'd say, well, in this kind of case, it's because he makes more physical output than the other employee. So that's why his contribution is valued more in subjective terms and why we pay him more. All right, so you wouldn't be committing the fallacy of the labor theory of value. So if you got that analogy, I'm claiming that I think Austrians have unfortunately treated Bawerk in a similar fashion, that he was not, he was always ultimately explaining interest through the mechanism of subjective valuation of higher value attributed to present versus future goods. He was just trying to show in the real world empirically one of the major mechanisms in his mind as to how physical facts about more capitalistic processes contributes to this general tendency for there to be a higher subjective valuation of present over future goods. Okay, we have now come to the end of our extensive treatment of Bawerk, and next lecture we will wrap up this course with Alfred Marshall and the neoclassical synthesis.